if our government wasn't a profligate slob wasting our money, we wouldn't necessarily have to worry so much about our trade deficit. Hey there, friends, fans, and foes of Dad Saves America. John Popola here. And how can I not talk about the news that is frankly rattling the entire world? President Trump's Liberation Day.
Chronic trade deficits are no longer merely an economic problem. They're a national emergency that threatens our security and our very way of life. It's a very great threat to our country. And for these reasons, starting tomorrow, the United States will implement reciprocal tariffs on other nations. For nations that treat us badly, we will calculate the combined rate of all their tariffs, non-monetary barriers, and other forms of cheating. And because we are being very kind, we're kind people, very kind.
Very kind.
The tariffs will...
Very kind. We're very kind. We're very kind with the tariffs.
The tariffs will be not a full reciprocal. I could have done that, yes, but it would have been tough for a lot of countries who didn't want to do that. I'd like to see the chart if you have it. Thanks, Al.
Here comes the chart.
So if you look at that, China, first row, China, 67%. That's tariffs charged to the USA, including currency manipulation and trade barriers. So 67%, I think you can, for the most part, see it. So it's 67%, so we're going to be charging a discounted reciprocal tariff of 34%. I think, in other words, they charge us, we charge them less. So how can anybody be upset?
How can anybody be upset? How can anybody be upset? Well, as you're going to see, there's a lot of people upset.
They will be, because we never charge anybody anything, but now we're going to charge. European Union, they're very tough, very, very tough traders. You think of European Union, very friendly. They rip us off. It's so sad to see. It's so pathetic. 39%, we're going to charge them 20%, so we're charging them essentially half.
Now, the first question is, what exactly are these numbers on this chart? This says the tariffs charged to the U.S., including currency manipulation and trade barriers, 67% China. Well, it turns out that 67% or 39% for the European Union really isn't about the tariffs that are being imposed on U.S. imports into those countries. On X, the White House actually got a community note noting that the reciprocal tariffs aren't actually based on tariffs, but are actually likely a kind of calculation of a percentage of our trade deficit with the country, which is the difference between how much we sell to them, the exports to that country from Americans to the Chinese or to Europeans, and the things that Americans buy from each of those countries. That is what is going on here. And another person on Twitter, an econ blogger, Alan Cole, wrote, "I can confirm I've replicated the CEA's calculation for the so-called tariffs charged to the U.S. on these charts, and it appears to basically be 10% of imports minus exports divided by imports on a per country basis." So this isn't reciprocal tariffs. It's something else. It's something much broader, and broader truly in that no one can escape. The White House press secretary and others are reinforcing something that you need to pay closer attention to, because it's part of what's trying to justify the president's ability to do this.
This is a national emergency. We have a $1.2 trillion trade deficit. We've had 90,000 factories close across our heartland. We've had 5 million manufacturing jobs go overseas since 1997. And President Trump is finally doing something about it by
a national emergency. You heard President Trump say that at the outset. A national emergency. So the first problem with what's going on. And I like President Trump, so I'm going to be critical here, but it is not because I want to be. I want him to succeed. But this policy has a lot of things that worry me, and I think maybe should worry you. The first is that he doesn't seem to have the power to actually do this. So The Constitution gives the Congress, not the president, the power to issue tariffs and levies and taxes. The president hasn't sought any new congressional authority to do this. And so this reference to national emergency, as best I can understand it, is an attempt by the administration to trigger the what's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. That is, I think, what is going on, framing what is not an eminent issue and not even necessarily something that falls under this kind of jurisdiction, which is to say extended trade deficits, as a national emergency, is part of the justification for why the president can unilaterally do this. It's pretty hard to argue that he can. And so this will be challenged in courts, much like President Biden's attempt to just wave a magic wand and eliminate student loan debts, or should I say not eliminate them, dump them on we, the taxpayer, instead of the students that actually took out the loans. That's what that actually was. That was equally problematic. This might be more so because this has the potential to impact a lot more people and be a bigger disruption. But let's keep going.
This won't be painful at all for American people and consumers, Caroline?
It's going to be, there's not going to be any pain for American-owned companies and American workers because their jobs are going to come back home. And again, as for prices, President Trump is working on tax cuts to put more money back into the pockets of Americans.
I think that's a misstep on their part to say there's not going to be any pain. There most certainly will be pain. And actually, President Trump, to his credit, has not shied away from the fact that there's going to be pain. These policies, if truly implemented, will be very disruptive to the economy. They will be disruptive to our trading partners, and they will have an impact on most of us in one way or another. Global leaders weren't exactly thrilled about this announcement this week.
President Trump's announcement of universal tariffs on the whole world, including the European Union, is a major blow to the world economy.
Nobody wins in a trade war. That is not in our national interest.
President Trump referred to reciprocal tariffs. A reciprocal tariff would be 0, not 10%.
That's an interesting point. Even countries with lower tariffs than 10% are still getting the 10% minimum. So there's something deeper going on here. This is not about exact reciprocity in the name of bringing tariffs down overall.
I strongly believe that tariffs benefit no one. They're bad for the world economy. They hurt people. They hurt businesses.
Of course, the trading partners aren't the only people to be upset. The markets are not too thrilled either.
But remember, yesterday was the second most active day in the equity options market on record. And it looks like today has surpassed that to overtake a record that was set back a few years ago. The Dow Jones Industrial Average that you're looking at on your screen right now, closing out the day lower by 5.5%.
Yeah, the front page of wallstreetjournal.com is the stuff of nightmares if you're a finance person. You open this thing up and it doesn't feel so great. You know, you can't rely on immediate stock market feedback to tell you whether something is good or not. That is sort of a hack way to look at public policy. Change will be disruptive. Markets don't like disruption. People don't want to see changes in the cost of things. And so this is a small indication, but I don't think it should be overplayed. That is not to say that I think it is a good idea, because I mostly do not. But where is the public on this? According to Gallup, this is from a couple years back. You know, the history of views on trade in the past several decades has varied and been mixed. But what's been most interesting to me is it's actually been somewhat bipartisan by and large. If you look here, you can see that since 2000, favorability for foreign trade and seeing foreign trade as an opportunity has basically moved in lockstep, Republicans, independents, and Democrats. It dipped during the financial crisis and actually was growing pretty steadily thereafter. But since 2020, especially for conservatives and Republicans, the views on trade cratered. And I think 2020 broke the world. And when I say 2020, I mean all of it. I mean the Wuhan virus and the COVID lockdowns, and that completely changed a lot of our views on China, on whether it is a net good or a net bad for all of us. All of it, all of the institutions, the Black Lives Matter protests, the lying, the censorship, the whole thing has thrown our world into chaos and caused all of us, I think, or at least a lot of us, to question all of our institutions, all of the so-called experts and elites who have consensus about things. And frankly, free trade has been, generally speaking, one of those points of consensus. And it's always been a complicated one because everyone likes low prices and nobody likes to lose their job. And so it's always been a fraught relationship. So what's going on? What are we really talking about? Fundamentally, what President Trump is targeting is our trade deficits, which is to say the difference between how many goods we buy from a country versus how many goods we sell to the country. And he's looking at it on a per country basis. But in the aggregate, the United States buys more goods and services from other countries than we sell to them. We run a trade deficit. And the flip side of that is actually what's called a capital surplus. Those dollars that end up in other countries have to go somewhere because they're US dollars. So in some cases, they're held onto and used to be traded between countries or to buy oil because the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world, which is to say it is used for those things. It's used as sort of a stable store of value and medium of exchange on the global marketplace. But ultimately, the trade deficit mirrors the capital account surplus. These dollars come back into the US and end up investing in US assets. That takes many forms, and I want to come back to that because that story is where things, for me, get harder to understand and not as clear-cut as most free marketeers like to say. But when it comes to the free market perspective on this, I don't think you can do better than the great Thomas Sowell.
Here's the question. How much should people really worry about the balance of trade?
Somewhat less than you worry about being struck by lightning.
Oh, that laugh. You're not doing yourself any favors with the laugh.
Okay, here's a statistic I heard just the other day. Here's how many cars Korea sells in the United States every year. 500,000. Here's how many cars we sell in Korea every year. 5,000. Why shouldn't we be worried about that imbalance?
And that right there, that's a perfect example of the question that we hear all the time from President Trump and others who are worried about trade deficits.
I'm not sure why we should. Obviously, if the Americans were Americans forced at gunpoint to buy these cars from Korea?
Clearly not. No. So no problem.
I don't see why third parties should concern themselves about it.
What's he saying there? What's he talking about? It's very flippant. It's a flippant response. The first argument here is sort of simple and ultimately an ethical one. And that is to say, who are you, government, to get in the way of me and someone else anywhere on this planet from trading and exchanging with each other? It's voluntary and it should be allowed. It should be part of what it means to be free in this country as a free society. I should be able to buy stuff from anybody I want, and I should be able to sell my stuff to anybody that wants to buy it from me. That is the fundamental mutual gains from trade at Econ 101 kind of thinking. What is it to you, the government, or what is it to you, my neighbor, who I buy from? And why does it matter if I buy from another country or another city or another state? We live in a very big country, 340 plus million people, and it is physically very large. It's larger than many countries. Our trade between states is often across greater distances and sometimes greater cultural divides than between many other places in the world. So the notion that buying American is very, very different than buying from a Canadian, let's say, especially so. Morally, ethically, economically. In one sense, you could say there isn't much of a difference. Now, of course, that's not exactly true, but I want to actually hone in on how we should think about what's going on with global trade and its impact on jobs, because I think fundamentally that ends up being the question. That is the question that President Trump has raised. He was rallying in front of labor unions and auto workers to debut his giant sign of tariffs. And I think it's worth putting these things in context. So, first of all, our trade deficit in 2024 was about $1 trillion. It was 918 billion to be exact. We exported 3.2 trillion with a T dollars of goods and services. We actually are the second biggest exporter in the world. And I think on a per capita basis, we are very much the first. So when we're thinking about global trade and the US economy, I think there are a couple of facts that are pretty important to get out of the way, especially because a lot of our rhetoric around this is really hyperbolic and very binary. We hear all the time, we don't make anything in America anymore. Everything is made in China. We don't produce. We don't manufacture. Our industrial base has been hollowed out. There are places for sure. I come from Pennsylvania, Allentown, Pennsylvania. You know, the Billy Joel song, we're living here in Allentown and they're closing all the factories down. That is real. There has been real dislocations in our society, and it's serious and it has had a big impact on communities. But we do make things here. We make a lot of things. In fact, when you look at the $3 trillion in exports from the United States to the world last year, what you find is quite a lot of stuff. And it's not all just financial services. In fact, out of our $3 trillion in exports, the biggest category is actually heavy machinery, industrial machinery, aircraft engines, semiconductors, medical equipment. This is capital goods and non-automotive capital goods. So we're making all kinds of stuff that is complicated and high value. Next in line is other industrial supplies, plastics, organic chemicals, newsprint, precious metals, raw cotton. The list goes on and on and on. We produce a lot of stuff. We also are a net exporter of oil and fuels. We're basically the new Saudi Arabia. So to say that America doesn't make anything is false. You're starting from a hyperbolic place that really sets the conversation back. The other piece of the puzzle that I very rarely see talked about, and this is probably the most important thing for you as an American, as a householder, as a dad, to understand, is that trade isn't the whole economy. I think one of the things that I don't like about the way President Trump talks about trade is he talks about America like it's a corporation, and like that our income of America is entirely what we export to the world. And if you think of America as a company, and if you think of Americans as being employees in America Inc., that makes sense. But it's not true because we mostly make things for each other and trade them in our gigantic 340 million person society. Our economy last year was $29.7 trillion. That includes net exports. So that is all of the economic activity, all of the exchanges between people, between companies, but ultimately between people that were made in 2024, 29.7 trillion with a T. So to put that in perspective, our trade deficit of just about $1 trillion is 3% of last year's GDP. 3%. Now, I want you to think about this for a second, about your daily life, about your annual life, about your life. Where do we as Americans spend our money? The biggest source of spending is our housing. That is manufactured here. Mostly, right? It has to be. Our homes are built here. Our repairs are built here. You need HVAC, it's built here. Yes, some of the parts might be imported, but most of the cost, all of the labor, is here in the US. Housing. Food. We're actually a major agricultural producer. And so a lot of our food is made here. Food is also not that large of a share of our income. As you go down the list, as you think about where you're spending money on a daily and weekly basis. Most of it is here. It is in your community. It is going to a restaurant, going to the movies, going to get your hair cut, going to see a doctor. Healthcare is a very large portion of our economy. It's almost 20% of GDP. And healthcare services are domestic. They are here. So the idea that our trade deficit has somehow wiped out our people or our middle class or our economy as a whole, it just doesn't pass the sniff test because it's just not that big of the total share of our economic activity. It has been disruptive. Consumer goods like electronics are overwhelmingly manufactured overseas. But even that story is more complicated. Take the iPhone. This thing. Yes, when you look at what this is, it says made in China. But this is actually kind of a lie because it actually touches at least 50 other countries. All of the components are spread out across the globe. Most of the value of the iPhone is actually created outside of China. In fact, most of it is created by Apple, the software, the design, the specifications of all of the major parts, especially like the CPU and the software. That's all Apple. It gets assembled in China, and because that happens, that purchase that ends up going from Shenzhen, China, and shipped to your house gets treated like the whole value came from China. But that is a misnomer. That is a misreading of what's going on. So I think that puts some of this in context. We aren't one company. We are a country. We are individuals. We are people. And so how trade impacts us and the scope of its impact is not what we're being told. But this is not to say that this isn't important. It's quite important. And the trade imbalances that we're experiencing might have bigger consequences than pure free trader, free marketeers like to admit. As I was saying earlier, that trade deficit is offset by a capital account surplus. Vice President Vance talks about one of the ways that capital account surplus comes back.
I think it's useful for all of us to step back and ask ourselves, what has the globalist economy gotten the United States of America? And the answer is fundamentally it's based on two principles: incurring a huge amount of debt to buy things that other countries make for us. And to make it a little bit more crystal clear, we borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture. That is not a recipe for economic prosperity. It's not a recipe for low prices, and it's not a recipe for good jobs in the United States of America. For 40 years, we have gone down that pathway. We've seen closing factories. We've seen rising inflation.
Now, there's a couple pieces that I think are a little off the mark, but he is pointing to something very real, which is a lot of those dollars that we send overseas come back to finance deficit spending by our government. And they also come back to buy financial assets, to buy debt, like corporate debt, and to buy equities, to buy land. So that $1 trillion a year is getting spent here, but it's getting spent to buy portions of ownership in us. And this can have consequences over the longer term. I want to share a clip from a film that was released many years ago, but I think touches on this in a really powerful way with Warren Buffett.
China had the largest trade surplus in the world. And who was dead last? The United States of America.
A few years ago, I wrote an article for Fortune on sort of the parable of Squandersville and Thriftsville, which was designed to simplify for people problems inherent in persistent and large trade imbalances. Economics tends to put people to sleep, and I thought maybe by creating a couple of islands with inhabitants of quite widely different activities that it might get across a point that otherwise they get lost on. The thrust is that if you own a lot of property, an island in this case, you can trade it off for the things that you eat and consume every day, and you can do that for a long time. But eventually you run out of property, and then you have to work a whole lot harder to provide your own needs, but also to pay back for the debt you've incurred. Short-term actions have long-term consequences that sometimes people don't think about in the short run. In the last few decades, but accentuating in the last 6 or 8 years, this country has started consuming considerably more than it produces. Because we're so rich, we can do it for a long time and we can do it on a large scale, but we can't do it forever. Eventually you run out. I mean, it's like a credit card. My credit's pretty good at the moment, and if I want to go out and quit working and have no income coming in but keep spending, I can, first of all, sell off the assets I have, and then after that, I can start borrowing on my credit card, and if I've got a good reputation, I can do that for quite a while. But at some point, I max out, and at that point, I have to start producing a whole lot more than I consume.
So this is the worst case scenario, right? We're running a $2 trillion deficit, as I said here, at the federal government level. A non-trivial part of that is being borrowed from abroad, from China and Japan, primarily, but more broadly. So at what point have they bought so much debt that they own the place? You know, there's a saying that if you owe the bank $100,000, the bank owns you. If you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank. And there is a point at which, perhaps, the debt held by foreigners could be a true national security problem. But even here, and I've been thinking about this today because this is the part that breaks my brain a little bit. So what is going on? We've got a $29 trillion economy, and we've got a $1 trillion trade deficit because we're importing more than we export. So those dollars are out there and they come back. Is that all going into the federal debt? Well, the answer can't be yes, because the federal debt is actually double the trade deficit, number one. Number two, would that be so bad? Well, I think for sure the answer to that is yes, because the government mostly just spends our money on consumption. That debt goes into the military, welfare payments for the sick and the old, and interest payments on the debt. That's where all the money basically goes. So the percentage of federal spending that you could say is actually investment for real, like investment as in I'm going to spend this money in a way that produces more value in the future, it's practically zero. It's practically none. Now, you could say, well, protecting the country from invasion is a kind of investment, just like investing in locks on your house. Fair enough. But what about other kinds of capital inflows from abroad? What if the Chinese and the Japanese and Europeans are taking their dollars and turning around and investing in American companies? Is this bad? Is this being bought by foreigners? And should we not want that? Well, I think that's more complicated. Because if you think about why you as a company would sell a piece of it, it is usually for a reason. And that reason is usually because you need that capital to grow your business. My wife and I had this experience when we were trying to start a cloth diaper business. We really could have used external capital to buy the inventory so that we could actually scale up enough to make it profitable. We never made the thing profitable, and the path was probably to take on outside investors. 100% of zero is zero. So if a Chinese investor or a Japanese investor or an Italian investor said, hey, I will invest in your company at X value and take a portion of it in exchange for you being able to grow this, well, that could have been a win-win-win. We could have invested in the equipment and the things necessary to grow a real business. And that is what investment actually does. Successful investment isn't just moving money around and extracting profits. Successful investment goes into equipment that makes you more productive. That means that you can create more value and increase the value for everyone. For your customers, because you can serve more of them. For your investors, because you grow the value of the firm and maybe issue dividends from your profits. And for you as the founder or the owner, the employees, the management, all of it. Investment is the engine of economic growth. And so in that respect, if our government wasn't a profligate slob wasting our money, we wouldn't necessarily have to worry so much about our capital account surplus or our trade deficit. That foreign investment would come right back into the country and help us grow just as it would if a Californian invested in my Texas-based firm. I realize that's a lot to hold in your head. And it's more complicated than that because I haven't even touched on exchange rates and currency manipulation and the craziness of the fiat money and the fact that we went off the gold standard in 1971 and that probably messed everything up. This stuff's all really complicated. There are winners and losers in the short run. When companies move abroad for cheaper labor or whatever, it hurts people. That's all true. But I don't think President Trump, God bless him, is right to do what he's trying to do, especially since it's probably not legal. And I think the biggest warning sign, the thing that is spooking markets and frankly spooking me, is that the last time we were here was the 1920s. And I am not a catastrophist, but the Smoot-Hawley tariffs played a much bigger role in inciting the Great Depression than most people realize. And I will come back to the great Thomas Sowell to wrap us out.
Why do some people worry about the trade balance then?
Oh, because the argument that they're making is that this is sending American jobs abroad. Now, unfortunately, this argument was made some years ago in 1930. 1,000 economists took out full-page ads across the country saying, do not put up international trade restrictions. It will not increase employment. It will just set off a new round of retaliation. It was one of those wonderful things the media like. It was a bipartisan effort. The Democratic Congress wanted to pass the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, and the Republican president signed it into law. And it was one of the biggest disasters in the history of the country. At the time this law, people think that the reason for the high unemployment in the 30s was because of the stock market crash.
Right.
After the stock market crash, unemployment peaked at 9% for 1 month and started downward. It was down to 6.3% before the federal government intervened.
This is a really important point. People think that the stock market crashed in 1929 and then everything went to hell in a handbasket. That's not true. That's not true at all. In fact, we were heading towards a similar recovery to the very rapid bounce back from the early 1920s after the end of World War I. And then the government intervention started to pile on.
It was only after the federal government intervened that the downward movement reversed itself and shot all up over a few years to 25%. So the people who are out there just dying for the government to come in with their solution, I don't know if they have studied history or not.
Mm.
The Smoot-Hawley tariffs laid waste to the economy in a couple ways. One of the reasons was that in the 1920s and 30s, about 40% of Americans worked in agriculture. And agriculture is very subject to very thin profit margins and booms and busts. So the Smoot-Hawley tariffs led to mass bankruptcies of American farmers. And because of our banking system being very fragmented at that time, all the regional banks that served these farmers failed. And that was one of the triggers of the banking collapse that produced the Great Depression. It's not the only reason. The Fed also screwed up and all kinds of other shenanigans were going on the monetary side. But we are not heading down a good course if we think we can repeat the mistakes of the past and have them turn out differently this time. I don't see a lot of reason why this time is different in general. This is to say nothing of other considerations that I think President Trump is rightly worried about. Our interconnectedness with China, who is an aggressive foreign adversary and doesn't share our values along a lot of dimensions. I think that is a justified concern. I think the worry about some of the goods that we are desperately needing to have in times of crisis, like antibiotics and microchips, I think these are things that are worthy of serious review. I don't think we should be doctrinaire here. Politics and geopolitics and national security are real things. But across the board tariffs on everybody, 10% and higher, I think that's something different. And I think that's something that reflects President Trump's understanding of the way the economy works. And I think this part is a misunderstanding. We are not America Inc. America is not a single business. America is a country filled with people, filled with businesses, and as big and complex and diverse as entire continents. And so I think we need to really think real hard about what's going on here and not get caught up in the partisan nonsense and how dare you criticize President Trump. I voted for him. I'm a fan. I know a lot of you are too, but we have to look reality in the face on this one. And I hope this has helped you understand some of the nuance that might be getting missed elsewhere. But let me know what you think. I will, of course, once again, put the links and research that went into this video on dadssavesamerica.com, so you can head over there, check it out, read the articles, watch the other videos, and please be sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and have a great weekend.